There is a name that still makes the stone walls of Paris shudder: Maximilien Robespierre. To his followers, he was the Incorruptible, a man of such rigid virtue that he lived in a small rented room while ruling a nation. To history, he is the architect of a nightmare that claimed thousands of lives. Imagine a man who once argued against the death penalty, but who would eventually turn the guillotine into a factory of death. It is the ultimate political true crime story, a journey from idealistic lawyer to the most feared man in Europe. But how does a champion of the people become their most terrifying judge? Here begins the rise and violent fall of the master of terror. Before he was the master of the guillotine, Robespierre was a small-town lawyer from Arras who truly hated the sight of blood. In his early years, he was known for defending the poor, the marginalized, and the forgotten. He was a man obsessed with the Enlightenment, particularly the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He believed in the inherent goodness of the people and the absolute necessity of virtue in politics. In a bizarre twist of fate, he even resigned from a local judgeship because he could not bring himself to sentence a criminal to death. He was a radical advocate for universal suffrage and the abolition of slavery. To the aristocrats of the 1780s, he was a nuisance, but to the starving peasants, he was a savior. He carried a quiet, cold intensity that most people mistook for mere shyness. However, beneath that powdered wig and modest suit was a mind that saw the world in absolute black and white. There was no room for compromise. For Robespierre, you were either a friend of the revolution or an obstacle to be removed. And as the revolution turned violent, so did his definition of virtue. By 1793, France was a bleeding wound. The country was at war with every major power in Europe, including Britain, Prussia, and Austria, while internal rebellions threatened to tear the Republic apart from within. Bread prices were soaring, and the streets of Paris were a powder keg. In this atmosphere of total chaos, the National Convention created a body designed to act with lightning speed, the Committee of Public Safety. It was supposed to be a temporary wartime measure. But under Robespierre's leadership, it became a shadow government with near absolute power. He began to articulate a chilling new philosophy, that terror was nothing more than prompt, severe, and inflexible justice. He argued that without terror, virtue was powerless, and without virtue, terror was fatal. This was the moment the revolution shifted from a fight for liberty to a fight for survival. The committee began to see enemies everywhere, in the markets, in the salons, and even in the Revolutionary Assembly itself. Suspicion became a civic duty. The guillotine was moved to the heart of Paris, and the list of suspects began to grow by the hundreds. But who was safe when the definition of a traitor changed every single day? The atmosphere in Paris became one of suffocating paranoia. The machine never stopped. Day and night, the heavy thud of the blade became the rhythmic heartbeat of Paris. During the period known as the Great Terror, the numbers were staggering. Official records show that over 17,000 people were sent to the guillotine across France, though the actual death toll, including those who died in prison or during massacres, likely exceeded 40,000. It wasn't just the nobility who suffered. In fact, over 80% of those executed were commoners, the very people Robespierre claimed to protect. A wrong word in a tavern, a lack of enthusiasm at a parade, or even being the relative of a suspect was enough to seal your fate. People stopped speaking in public. They stopped looking each other in the eye. Neighbors denounced neighbors to prove their own revolutionary zeal. It was a true crime story played out on a national scale, where the state was the perpetrator and the entire population was the victim. Robespierre remained at the center of it all, cold, calculating, and convinced that every drop of blood was washing the Republic clean. But as the piles of bodies grew, even his most loyal supporters began to wonder, when would the cleansing end? The answer was, not until the architect himself was consumed by his own creation. In June 1794, Robespierre introduced a piece of legislation that was essentially a death warrant for a nation, the Law of 22 Prairial. This law was a legal nightmare. It stripped away the right to a defense lawyer. It removed the need to call witnesses. Most terrifyingly, it allowed the Revolutionary Tribunal to convict based on moral proof rather than physical evidence. There were only two possible outcomes for any trial: acquittal or death. In the weeks following this law, the number of executions in Paris skyrocketed to nearly 30 a day. The streets literally smelled of blood. Even the most hardened revolutionaries began to feel the cold steel of the guillotine at their own necks. Robespierre had created a system so efficient that it no longer needed him to function. He had become a victim of his own logic. If anyone could be a traitor, and no evidence was required to prove it, then no one in the convention was safe. The members of the government realized that if they didn't destroy Robespierre, he would eventually destroy every single one of them. The question was no longer about ideology. It was about survival. But who would be brave enough to strike first? On July 26, 1794, the 8th of Thermidor by the revolutionary calendar, Robespierre climbed the podium of the National Convention for the last time. He gave a rambling, 2-hour speech filled with vague threats. He claimed there was a new conspiracy of scoundrels within the government itself. But then, he made his fatal error. He refused to name names. He looked out at the assembly and essentially told every man in the room that he might be on the next list for the guillotine. It was a psychological blunder of epic proportions. By threatening everyone, he forced his enemies, and even his former friends, to unite against him. That night, a frantic conspiracy formed in the shadows of Paris. Men who hated each other whispered in the dark, realizing that they had less than 24 hours to live unless they acted. They spent the night counting votes and securing the support of the National Guard. The Incorruptible had finally provided his enemies with the one thing they needed to overcome their fear: a common, desperate purpose. The stage was set for the most dramatic showdown in French history. But would the people of Paris rise to save their master? The next day, the convention was a scene of pure bedlam. When Robespierre tried to speak, he was drowned out by cries of "Down with the tyrant." A deputy shouted, "The blood of Danton chokes you," referring to the friend Robespierre had sent to the blade months earlier. The convention voted for his immediate arrest. In a desperate move, Robespierre and his few remaining allies fled to the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall of Paris. They hoped the Paris mob would rise up to protect them, but the people were exhausted. They were tired of the blood, tired of the fear, and tired of the breadlines. As the troops of the convention burst into the room, a single gunshot rang out. To this day, historians debate what happened. Did Robespierre try to take his own life? Or did a young gendarme named Murder fire the shot? Regardless, the result was horrific. The bullet shattered Robespierre's lower jaw, leaving him unable to speak. He was found lying on a table, bleeding profusely, his face wrapped in a bloody bandage. The man who had ruled through the power of his words was now silenced forever. He was dragged back to the very prison where he had sent so many others. His reign was over. But the final act was yet to come. Robespierre's final hours were a masterpiece of irony and agony. He spent the night lying on a table in the Committee of Public Safety, the very room where he had signed thousands of death warrants. He couldn't speak, could barely breathe, and was mocked by the men who had once trembled at his feet. On the evening of July 28, 1794, he was taken to the Place de la Révolution. As the cart wound through the streets, the crowds didn't weep. They cheered, they spat, they cursed the man who had turned their revolution into a slaughterhouse. When he reached the scaffold, the executioner ripped the bandage from his shattered jaw. A blood-curdling scream echoed across the square, the only sound he had made in nearly 24 hours. Moments later, the blade fell. It was a swift, clinical end to a man who had made death a political tool. With his head held high for the crowd to see, the reign of terror effectively died with him. The prisons were opened, the laws were repealed, and the nation took its first collective breath in years. But, in the vacuum left by the Incorruptible, a new kind of power was already beginning to stir. The death of Robespierre didn't bring the perfect republic he had envisioned. Instead, it brought the Thermidorian reaction, a period of corruption, instability, and a white terror against the former radicals. The French people were so traumatized by the years of blood and virtue that they craved one thing above all else: order. They were done with lawyers and philosophers. They wanted a savior who could win battles and put bread on the table. This paved the way for a young, ambitious artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte. Within 5 years of Robespierre's execution, Napoleon would seize power in a coup, eventually crowning himself emperor. The revolution that began with the dream of total equality ended with a military dictatorship. It's a sobering political lesson. When a movement prioritizes abstract virtue over human rights and terror over due process, it usually ends in the very tyranny it sought to destroy. Robespierre remains a warning from history, a man who loved humanity so much that he found it necessary to kill the humans who got in the way. But what if he had never been arrested? Would the revolution have survived, or would there be anyone left to witness it? Maximilien Robespierre's story is a chilling reminder of how quickly idealism can turn into atrocity. He began as a defender of the poor and ended as the face of the guillotine. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darker side of history, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the Eerie Historian. Let us know in the comments, was Robespierre a monster or a man pushed to the edge by circumstance? Until next time.